Hello there. Today I'm in Emirates Business Class lounge in Concourse B of the airport at Dubai. And when I got here, one of the wines I noticed they had available on the counter was a wine called Seña, which is produced by the Chadwick family of Errazuriz and started out as a joint venture between the Chadwicks and Robert Mondavi, the famous American wine producer from the Napa Valley. And the wine that they had there was the 2015 vintage of that. I should say they did actually give me a slightly better pour than this, but I had a slight accident and spilled some of it. So Seña was set up in 1995, as I say, it was a joint venture, with the idea of making a world-class wine with a real Chilean soul, something that would be the equivalent in quality of, say, Bordeaux first growth. Now, Seña really made a name for itself in 2004, when the 2001 vintage did very well in a tasting set up by the Chadwick family that has since become referred to as the Judgement of Berlin. The wine was put up against the Bordeaux first growths and some Super Tuscan wines as well, and a blind tasting conducted by experts came in ahead of all of those. It's worth noticing actually that the 2001 Seña actually came second in the tasting overall, behind another Chadwick wine, the 2000 vintage of Verdot Chadwick. And certainly I've heard discussions that suggest that the style of the Chilean wines was much more approachable, young, and therefore of course they'd do well in a tasting such as that had been set up by the wine's owners. But the tasters were internationally recognised experts. And I think it has some validity in showing they'd achieved their goals and produced a world-class wine. Now the wine comes from a 42-hectare estate in the Aconcagua Valley, so we're about 60 to 100 kilometres north of Santiago, in a valley that runs from east to west down to the sea, probably about 40 kilometres from the sea, at altitudes of between 300 and 500 metres above sea level. The soils here are a combination of volcanic soils, colluvial soils and alluvial soils. So particularly the volcanic soils and the colluvial soils tend to be very free draining with high proportions of rock, 80% in the colluvial soils I'm told. The vineyards here are on northeast facing slopes with steepness levels of between 5 and 15%. Now Errazuriz have been working to an extent with biodynamic viticulture since the early 2000s. I think their first vineyard was certified in 2004, but the vineyards for Seña have been certified as biodynamic since 2005. Among the things that this means for their vineyard management is that they make all their own compost, and actually they run sheep in the vineyard, which adds a certain amount of natural manure as well. So the climate is broadly Mediterranean, but there are plenty of cooling influences coming both from the sea and from the mountains. So you'll find the valley funnels onshore and offshore winds to cool the vineyard, particularly from the fact that the sea here it is quite cold thanks to the cooling Humboldt current from the Antarctic, which runs close inshore here. So you tend to have a good diurnal temperature range, which helps retain perfume in the fruit and acidity. Now, as for the 2015 vintage, the preceding winter was mild with average rainfall. In general, the season of 2014 through to 2015, when it was harvested, was moderately warm and dry. There was some rain in March, which refreshed the vines. The spring started warm with a hot October, but then got cooler for November and December. But it was dry, and these moderate late spring temperatures ensured a good flowering and fruit set. And actually what this meant was that there was a balanced crop set right throughout the vineyard. Now temperatures built steadily through February, March and April. In fact, March and April seeing record temperatures. And this was where the balanced fruit set right across the vineyard actually helped mitigate these high temperatures, ensuring even ripening of all the fruit. However, they did still have to be careful, and in order to maintain freshness and perfume in the fruit, they actually picked between 7 and 12 days earlier than usual. Everything was hand-picked. There was great care taken to ensure the fruit wasn't damaged before it reached the winery. So it was put into shallow 12-kilogram crates for transport, and then at the winery was sorted thoroughly on sorting tables to remove any damaged, unripe, undersized, or I would guess rotten fruit, although I don't see a note saying there was particularly high fungal pressure for this vintage. Now fermentation went on in stainless steel tanks, and temperature was regulated to between 24 and 31 degrees Celsius. So getting up to 31 degrees, relatively extractive, but not too hot. The length of maceration varied, with Cabernet Sauvignon, Carmenere, Malbec and Cabernet Franc being allowed to macerate for between 50 and 30 days, while the Petit Verdot, generally a richer, denser variety, was only allowed to macerate for between 8 and 12 days. The final blend was 57% Cabernet Sauvignon, 21% of Carmenere, Chile's own grape. I think that portion of the blend possibly responsible for giving some particularly Chilean style to the wine. You've got 12% of Malbec, quite a high proportion of that, 7% of Petit Verdot, and just 3% of Cabernet Franc. The wine was then put into oak to age for 22 months. Of that, 88% of the wine went into, they say barrels, I'm assuming that's 225 litre barriques. This was French oak. The remaining 12% going into larger foudre, which I assume would be seasoned oak. Of the 88% that was put into barrel, the split of that was 65% of the total went into new oak and 23% went into second fill oak barrels. So let's take a look at the wine, what's left of it after my little mishap. Certainly I'd say the wine has a really good colour. It's a deep, dark colour. I have to say, I ended up with the bottom portion of the bottle, so there is a little bit of sediment in my glass. But this is an almost black ruby colour. The alcohol on this wine is given on the label as 13.5%, but it's very difficult to see with all the sediment whether that's clinging particularly to the glass or not. Not surprisingly, the sediment that's showing suggests to me this is going to be quite a tannic wine. I might have to strain it through my teeth, but let's see how we get on with it, shall we? The aromas start with some sort of quite clean, fresh, leafy Cabernet Cassis notes, but they're followed by notes of cedar, sort of lead pencils, that combination of cedar wood and graphite. It's quite classic, quite vivid, relatively powerful. So let's have a taste. Yes, there's a little more sediment in that mouthful. It's a shame I spilled some of the wine, because tasting it earlier, it really had a sort of very clean, high note of cassis, vivid, juicy blackberry. There was lovely acidity supporting the wine and balanced alcohol. Currently, tasting this with a little more sediment evident, there's more of a sort of a plummy note of what I guess are the Carmenere, perhaps the slight meatiness of Malbec coming through there as well, providing a broader, more rounded mid-palate. The wine's acidity is keeping this bright fruit to the fore. It doesn't show as being particularly high, but even with the wine from the bottom of the bottle, there's a lovely freshness of the fruit staying right across the palate. There clearly is finely integrated grainy oak. The texture is there, but actually on the palate, it's largely being subverted by this quite nice, pure, concentrated black fruit that's giving black currant, blackberry, black cherry note right through to quite a long, fresh finish. The fact that I'm salivating makes it clear to me that there's good acidity there. And perhaps also the fact that this only has 13.5% alcohol is actually allowing that fresh fruit to shine through on the finish. Now I took a look at the Wine Search aggregated critics score on this, and that gives this wine 95 out of 100. I certainly think the wine is worth that. I have also noticed references to the fact that James Suckling evidently gave this wine 100 points. I have to say, from my earlier tasting of this sample when it was fresh, I would have marked this at 96 or 97 out of 100 because of its beautiful, precise freshness, its balance, its concentration. Now, given that all that has come from a tasting sample that was the bottom of a bottle that may well have been open for a while, it's possible that I'm not getting the full effect of the wine. But nonetheless, it is quite spectacular and a real joy to find a wine like this to taste while I'm on my travels. Certainly it makes me think this is a wine I would like to revisit at some stage under better circumstances. The other thing I noted about this wine is the fact the drinking window for it is recommended as between 2018 and 2030, and I've seen some notes saying 2030 plus. I think the wine has a nice level of maturity and balance now. I could certainly see it lasting out to 2030. There's the good acidity and the very fine structure should enable it to do that. Going much beyond that, I'm not entirely sure. The wine's real virtue is its freshness of this beautiful fruit. The acidity seems to be doing a very good job of maintaining that. Whether that's likely to be the case in another 10 years or so, I'm not quite so sure. But once again, maybe that's not a conclusion I can make definitively based on the quality of this sample. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you found the tasting of interest. If you have enjoyed it, it would be great if you'd press the like button. If you're watching these tastings, enjoy them, would like to watch more of them, do please consider signing up to my YouTube channel. That would be a great help. And also that way you can set yourself an alert to be notified every time I publish a new tasting, and then you won't miss them. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the tasting, feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your support in that way. And if you have any comments or questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else like that. I'll leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's available near you and at what price. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time in the very near future. Come and join me for another tasting. So hopefully we'll see you there. Bye for now.